They called it a peace meeting, but someone brought bullets, and when the white flag fell, so did the last reason to hope. If you thought the betrayal in episode 1 was the worst it could get, then I'm glad you're back, because what comes next is where peace burns for real. Welcome to episode 2 of the Modoc War series, where memory bleeds into resistance and history gets louder the moment someone finally shoots back. In our last episode, we stood at the edge of something terrible. A flag raised for peace was answered with fire, and Captain Jack walked away from the ruins of his people's homes with nothing but silence and the weight of everything lost. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't call for war. He only wanted to breathe in the land that had always been theirs. But peace is a fragile thing, and when you break it, the pieces cut everyone. Welcome back. I'm really glad you're here because this chapter is hard, and I don't think anyone should carry it alone. How are you doing tonight? Are you somewhere safe? Are you breathing steady? Do you have space to sit with something that won't let go easy? Because the story we're about to enter, it's not just a battle report. It's a moment where fear speaks louder than reason, where a warning shot becomes the opening act of a war, and where a single misfire makes history bleed. This episode takes us to the banks of Lost River, to a morning so cold even the horses could feel something wasn't right, where one man raises his voice, and another raises his pistol, and within seconds the dream of peace is replaced by the screams of mothers and the fire of retreat. We'll stand there together in the frozen dust with soldiers who came for obedience and found defiance, and with Modoc warriors who had never wanted to be fighters but now have no other name to wear. Stay with me, because what happens next isn't about who shot first. It's about what gets lost the moment the smoke rises and nobody listens anymore. It started with the sound of hooves over frozen soil. Not loud, not fast, but steady. The kind of sound that makes birds pause and dogs hide behind brush. Captain James Jackson had orders to move south with 35 cavalry troopers from Fort Klamath, and they were joined by a dozen civilian volunteers, men from Linkville who carried more whiskey than discipline. Some came with rifles. Some came with stories about Modoc raids that had never happened, and all came with the same belief that fear was reason enough to act. The official order was clear use force only if fired upon, but orders written on paper are nothing against the fire-litten men who've already decided who the enemy is. They said they came to bring the Modoc back to the reservation, but what they really came for was to remind them that requests were no longer being made. As they approached Lost River on that frigid morning, the sky was pale with frost. The ground cracked underfoot, and every tree stood still like it was holding its breath. Across the banks, 2 Modoc camps had been built, one under Captain Jack to the west, and another under Hooker Jim and Scarface Charlie to the east. They weren't fortified, weren't hidden. They weren't expecting a fight. Captain Jack had met with Indian agents just days before, still hoping they would finally allow his people to stay to live along the river without fear. He didn't build walls. He didn't post guards. He believed there was still a chance for words. But not everyone who came that morning believed in words. As the soldiers dismounted and spread into formation, Scarface Charlie spotted them first. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He raised his rifle and fired one warning shot into the air, a sound not meant to start war, but to wake the camp. That shot, that single crack over the frozen river would echo for generations. Soldiers flinched. Volunteers gripped their weapons. A translator from the Applegate family, famous for charting the emigrant trail, spurred his horse away and shouted that the Modoc were preparing to attack. In truth, they were scrambling to figure out what was happening. Captain Jack was still inside his lodge when the shooting began. He thought they were coming to talk. The army thought they were under threat. And somewhere in between, the truth bled out before anyone could speak it aloud. Jackson gave the order. Lieutenant Fraser Boutelle stepped forward to disarm Scarface Charlie. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a spark meeting dry grass. Scarface Charlie refused. Boutelle moved closer. Both men drew pistols. 2 cracks split the air almost as one. One bullet grazed Boutelle's sleeve. The other tore feathers from Charlie's headdress. No one died in that moment, but the Modoc War was now alive. There's a moment in every story where tension becomes motion, where choice becomes consequence. That shot was the moment. The soldiers opened fire. The volunteers followed. Modoc warriors dove for weapons or shouted to protect the women and children. Captain Jack emerged into chaos. Horses reared, arrows flew, black powder choked the winter air, and within minutes the snow was stained red. The screams came next, not from warriors, but from mothers clutching children and elders frozen by the terror of not knowing where to run. A few Modoc grabbed bows, others rifles, but many only had their hands. The lodges were burning. The river, once quiet, now caught echoes of musket fire and chaos bouncing off the ice. And in the middle of it all, Captain Jack shouted to hold fire, to fall back, to stop, but his voice drowned beneath the thunder of panic. The soldiers didn't know who they were shooting at. The Modoc didn't know if anyone was still listening. This was no coordinated battle. This was fear meeting fear. One young Modoc boy, no more than 12, tried to help his grandmother to safety. A bullet struck the ground beside them, then another found her leg. She didn't scream. She just sank to the dirt, still holding on to the blanket she had wrapped around him. Moments like that don't make it into the official reports, but they live forever in the memory of those who survived. And maybe that's the part people forget about history. It isn't written by the victors. It's carried by those who watched everything they loved catch fire. That morning at Lost River didn't begin with war. It began with confusion. But when a white flag gets answered by a pistol, you don't get to explain what you meant. You only get to run or shoot or bleed. They didn't plan to run, but they had no choice. The moment the last shot echoed over the banks of Lost River, the Modoc scattered into the cold. They weren't retreating in defeat. They were fleeing in shock. The ground was slippery with frost and blood, and the smoke rising from their burning lodges blurred everything behind them. Captain Jack gave the order to fall back, not to surrender, but to survive. He didn't know what came next. He only knew that staying meant more children dying, more elders falling behind more silence from the men who were supposed to bring peace. The Modoc gathered quickly. Women lifted the wounded onto makeshift litters. Men covered the rear arrows, notched eyes sharp. Some still believed the soldiers would stop once they left the riverbank, but the soldiers didn't follow, not yet. The flames were enough for now. The army had sent a message. The Modoc heard it loud and clear. They made their way south, away from the Lost River, into land only they knew well: the lava beds. To anyone unfamiliar, it was a landscape built to break ankles and test the will. Jagged stone, uneven ground, endless ridges and hidden caves that twisted for miles. To the Modoc, it was sanctuary. It was memory. It was a place that had protected them in darker times. Captain Jack remembered stories from his grandfather of warriors hiding in these very rocks to escape slavers and soldiers decades before. Now he was returning not as a boy, but as a man leading the remnants of a people under siege. As the first day passed, the air thickened with grief. The injured cried out in the night. Children asked when they could go home. There was no answer. What once was a peaceful band of families had now become a displaced nation carrying its pain on foot. And in that pain, something else stirred. Not in Captain Jack, not yet, but in Hooker Jim. He had seen too much. His cousin had been killed by one of the volunteers. His sister's lodge had burned before she could pull her youngest out. When he found her body, he said nothing, just walked. But his silence was sharp, the kind that cuts deeper the longer it lasts. That night, as the Modoc rested beneath the stars in the shifting black stone, Hooker Jim gathered a few trusted warriors. They were not the loudest, not the strongest, but they had lost someone too. They moved without a word, following trails only they could see. By dawn, the revenge had begun. It wasn't planned as a campaign. It was grief with a weapon. They found isolated ranches, settlers who had nothing to do with the Army's actions, men and women who likely hadn't even heard the first shots fired at Lost River. But to Hooker Jim, the time for questions was gone. He saw only symbols of everything that had been taken, and he answered with fire. 14 settlers died over the course of 2 days. Some were shot, some stabbed. A few, including children, were left untouched because even in pain there were still lines that not everyone was willing to cross. But the damage was done. The news spread fast. Headlines didn't say why. They didn't mention the white flag, or the mother who died with her baby in her arms, or the lodge set ablaze before anyone had time to speak. They said massacre. They said uprising. They said savage. And just like that, Captain Jack found himself trapped not just by lava, but by the shadow of what his people had done. When Hooker Jim returned, he didn't ask for permission. He didn't explain. He simply said it had to be done. And in that moment, the true war began. Not just between the Modoc and the United States, but within the Modoc themselves. Captain Jack was a man of control, a leader who believed in discipline in protecting honor as much as land. But now he stood before his people, half of whom cheered Hooker Jim for standing tall, and the other half looked to Jack to stop the blood from spilling further. He said nothing. Not yet. Because sometimes even leaders don't know which way the wind is blowing until it cuts their own skin. That night he sat alone near the edge of the stone cliffs. The stars above didn't blink. They watched silent and distant. And somewhere deep below in the cracks of that lava field a fire stirred. Not one of anger, but of inevitability. The path into the lava beds was not a road, not a trail, not something meant to carry the weight of an entire people. It was rock black and jagged, twisted like the memory of a wound that never healed. The Modoc did not walk into it. They bled into it every step, a statement that they would not go quietly. Captain Jack didn't choose the lava beds because they were easy to defend. He chose them because they were the only place left where his people had not yet been hunted down. To the white soldiers and settlers, the lava fields were a nightmare. To the Modoc, they were the bones of their ancestors, cracked and dry, but still strong. They knew every crevice, every hidden gap where wind vanished and voices carried. And as the sun faded on that first day, they began to dig in. Not to hide, to hold, Women dug trenches with bare hands. Men carried stones to build low walls and sniper positions. Elders offered memories of old warpaths, places where vision bent and sound deceived. Children were quiet, not from fear, but because even they understood that silence was now armor. Captain Jack moved like a man carrying something heavier than a rifle. He checked every corner, watched every fire, spoke few words, but made sure everyone was fed, even if there wasn't much to give. They had lost everything at Lost River: homes, supplies, innocence. But here in the lava beds, they still had ground under their feet, and that meant they still had a chance. They called it Jack's stronghold, not because he claimed it, but because he never left it. He slept on stone, ate what little others did, and listened. Always listened. He knew the soldiers would come. He knew Hooker Jim's retaliation had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. But for now, his job was to make sure the next bullet wouldn't come easy. Scouts were posted on high ridges. Watchfires were set low to avoid detection. At night, they trained quietly, moving through the stone like smoke, practicing how to vanish in plain sight. There was no cavalry charge here, no speeches, just the steady grind of people refusing to disappear. One of the young warriors, no more than 16, asked Captain Jack if he thought they could win. Jack didn't answer. He looked out over the horizon toward the north, toward Fort Klamath, where soldiers were gathering, where artillery was being loaded. Then he said, "Winning is not what we came here to do. Surviving is." And maybe that was the clearest truth anyone had spoken in months. The lava beds were not a dream. They were not hope. They were a declaration. You will not erase us, not without cost. That week they mapped the terrain with bare feet, found springs hidden beneath thorny brush, marked ambush paths with bones and carved stones. It wasn't war the way books described. It was something older, something rooted. The kind of war fought by people who know they have no reinforcements coming. The kind of war where the land itself fights beside you. Jack's stronghold became more than a place. It became a presence. Soldiers would speak of it later with dread, of how sounds vanished in the lava, of how voices came from nowhere, of how every step felt watched. And they were right, because the Modoc were no longer waiting. They were ready. Ready to make the stone scream. Ready to defend the only ground that had never betrayed them. And deep inside the stronghold, beneath the quiet, there was something else. Not rage, not vengeance, but a kind of stillness. The kind you find in the eye of a storm. The kind that waits not because it's afraid, but because it knows what comes next will demand everything. Some say the strongest walls are built from stone. Others say they're built from conviction. But out here in the lava beds, the Modoc had both. And as night settled once more over the stronghold, every breath they took was not just for survival, but as a promise. We are still here, and we are not done yet. Hooker Jim didn't speak much after the retreat, not to Captain Jack, not to the others. He stayed close to the edge of the stronghold, pacing like a wolf that had lost the scent of peace. His eyes didn't move much, but they saw everything. The wounded, the burned, the children trying not to cry. He heard every breath caught in the throats of mothers who no longer knew what to promise, and he carried it all, not like a leader, like a fire with no wind to contain it. They say some men are born for war. Hooker Jim wasn't. He was made by it, shaped by what he saw back at Lost River. His sister shot in the back, his cousin lying in a burned lodge with her arms wrapped around a child too still. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He remembered every face, every shot, every smile on the lips of those volunteers who called it justice. And that night, as the lava beds held the tribe in their first bitter shelter, Hooker Jim stood and did not ask for permission. He looked at the other warriors and they followed, not because he was captain, but because pain makes its own gravity. They moved through the dark like ghosts, silent and guided by memory. These weren't warriors hardened by decades of battle. These were men who had buried their families with their own hands. Some carried rifles, others carried knives, but all of them carried something sharper, the knowledge that no one was coming to protect them, and so they became the protection. They headed west toward the scattered settlements near Tool Lake. Isolated ranches, lonely cabins, places where fear had not yet arrived but would. The first house belonged to a man who had spoken kindly to the Modoc once, but he had also carried a shotgun when he joined the volunteer militia. Hooker Jim didn't knock. He didn't explain. He simply opened the door. A shot rang out. It hit one of the warriors in the side. The others surged in. The house burned minutes later. By sunrise, 3 were dead, and the silence that followed was not relief. It was a storm waiting to unfold. Over the next 2 days, Hooker Jim and his group moved like a whisper soaked in gasoline. They hit 4 more homesteads. 14 settlers died. Some were men who had fought at Lost River. Others were not. Women, young men, even a teenage boy who ran instead of fought. None of it mattered, because when pain chooses targets, it no longer sees faces. It only sees shadows. Back at the stronghold, word spread fast. Captain Jack confronted Hooker Jim. No witnesses say they shouted. No punches were thrown. But the camp held its breath, because this was the moment everyone feared. That pain would divide what fear had only weakened. Hooker Jim said they started it. Jack said we aren't them. Jim said the soldiers won't stop. Jack said killing their families won't make them stop faster. And neither of them were wrong. That was the worst part. Jack knew revenge would only bring more soldiers, more cannons, more death. But he also knew his own hands had no blood, and still his people were dying. The elders asked for patience. The mothers asked for protection. The warriors asked if Jack would fight when the army came. But no one asked Hooker Jim to stop, because some part of them believed he was saying what they couldn't voice out loud. That peace was no longer waiting. It had walked away the day that White Flag hit the dirt. That night, the camp went quiet, in a different way. Not the silence of fear, but of reckoning. Everyone knew what Hooker Jim had done. Some lit fires for the dead, even if they didn't know their names. Others sat in circles, holding hands not to pray, but to remember what it felt like to be human before all of this. Captain Jack didn't speak to the group that evening. He sat alone, watching the stars, listening to the wind curl through the broken rocks. He wondered how long they had before the retaliation came, and whether there would be enough left of them to resist it. He thought of the settlers who had died, and then of the Modoc who had died first. He thought of justice and mercy, and how far away both now seemed. Some warriors sharpened their knives that night. Others sharpened their memories. Hooker Jim slept near the fire, calm, unshaken. He believed he had done what had to be done, and maybe in a world that had already stopped listening, that belief was the only shield he had left. The stronghold grew quiet, but not calm. After Hooker Jim's retaliation, there was no celebration, no resolution, just a heaviness that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. People spoke in hushed tones, not out of fear, but because they didn't know what came next. Some looked to Captain Jack for direction, others looked to Hooker Jim with a different kind of loyalty. The unity that had brought them into the lava beds was beginning to crack. Not because of weakness, but because grief speaks many languages, and not all of them agree. Captain Jack spent more time alone now, not because he was afraid, because he was thinking. Every choice he made now would carry a cost. Every word might turn friend into rival. He knew war was coming, but he still wanted to believe they could hold it off just a little longer, long enough to negotiate, long enough to be heard. But the world outside the lava beds had already made its decision. Soldiers were gathering at Fort Klamath, more than before, not just cavalry, artillery, heavy guns, supplies, ammunition, the kind of preparation that doesn't speak of peace. The newspapers called the Modoc murderers. Washington sent messages demanding justice. Settlers armed themselves, and through it all, the lava beds remained still, watching, listening, preparing. Inside the stronghold, roles began to take shape. Scarface, Charlie took over training the younger warriors, showing them how to move through the lava like shadows. The elders carved signs into the stone ancient markings to guide their people if the worst came. Women sharpened tools, prepared food, reinforced shelters. Children were taught to stay quiet, to crawl, to listen for signals instead of shouting for help. This was no longer a camp. It was a nation under siege. But it was also something more. It was a reminder that the Modoc had not vanished. They could still fight, still think, still build, still choose who they were, even when the world tried to erase them. Captain Jack met with his closest circle each night. They mapped out blind spots in the terrain, created decoy trails, buried supplies in hidden crevices. They spoke little of politics, only of survival. Hooker Jim did not attend every meeting, but he sent scouts, passed along observations. He didn't apologize for what he had done, and Jack didn't ask him to, because both knew there was no going back. The only question now was how far forward they could go without losing themselves in the process. One night, as frost clung to the edges of every rock, Captain Jack addressed the people, not with a speech, with a story. He told of a time before the white men came when the Modoc moved like the wind through the valleys, when the land was not a battlefield but a song. He spoke not to inspire war, but to remind them of what they were defending. Not just land, but memory, dignity, existence. Afterward, a child approached him, asked if the soldiers would really come. Jack knelt and looked him in the eye. "They're already on their way," he said, "but we're not waiting for them. We're preparing for them." And those words quiet as they were rippled through the camp like fire through dry grass. People began to work with renewed focus, not from fear, but from clarity. The Modoc were no longer hoping to avoid the storm. They were becoming the mountain it would crash against. Scouts reported movements near the forest edge, distant hoofbeats, smoke trails that didn't belong to any Modoc camp. The soldiers were close now, days, maybe hours. Captain Jack ordered everyone to their roles. No more hesitation, no more questions. The time for choosing had passed. They had chosen. And what came next would not just test their courage, it would define their legacy. And as dawn crept across the edges of the stone, casting long shadows across faces that had not truly slept in days, there was no sound of fear, only readiness. Whatever came next, whether it was death or survival, it would meet a people who refused to be erased. The lava beds were waiting, and so were they. When the smoke cleared at Lost River, it didn't mark the end of something. It marked the beginning. Not of war, not entirely, but of a silence between worlds that could no longer hear each other. Captain Jack didn't want this. He didn't raise his rifle in rage. He raised it because there was no other way left to stand. Hooker Jim didn't strike because he loved to fight. He struck because the world had already declared who mattered and who didn't, and he refused to accept that silence was survival. And in the lava beds under stars older than the war itself, a people who had already lost their land, their treaties, their trust, stood up and said no more. Not here. Not like this. History will say the Modoc were outnumbered, that they had no chance. But history rarely counts the courage of those who fight with nothing left but dignity. Maybe that's why this story matters. Because it's not about who wins. It's about who refuses to vanish. I hope you're still here with me, because if this episode felt heavy, it's because it was meant to be. These aren't just pages in a textbook. These are echoes, and they deserve to be heard. So before we close this chapter, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt forced to make a choice you didn't want? Not because you believed in the outcome, but because not choosing meant disappearing. That's where the Modoc stood. And now, as the soldiers close in, as the stronghold prepares for war, the question is no longer if a battle is coming. The question is how far you're willing to go to defend something that was never meant to be taken. In the next episode, the United States Army will enter the lava beds. They will bring cannons, hundreds of men, and the certainty that one tribe can't stand against a nation. But they're wrong, because what they'll find is not just resistance, it's precision, it's fury. It's a people fighting not for conquest, but for the right to remain. Stay with me, because Jack's stronghold is waiting, and the real fire hasn't even started.